Hello, class. My name is Michael Long, and I will be doing my presentation today on John Dewey, the father of pragmatism. Starting with his bibliography, John Dewey was born on October 20th, 1859, in Burlington, Vermont, and died on June 1st, 1952. He was the third born in the family of Lucina and Archibald Dewey. Dewey's mother was the daughter of a well off agriculturalist and a fervent Calvinist. Dewey's merchant dad left his grocery trade and became a Union Army soldier in Civil warfare. John's father was known to share his passion for British writings with his children. Archibald became the owner of a prosperous tobacco factory after the warfare, affording the family a content life as well as financial security. When Dewey grew up, he excelled at Burlington Public School, and while he was 15 years old, he enrolled in the University of Vermont, studying philosophy under the guidance of Henry, also known as Hap Torrey. After graduating from the University of Vermont, his cousin, who was a principal in Oil City, Pennsylvania, offered him a teaching job that he gladly accepted. However, he only worked there for 2 years before being let go when his cousin resigned as the school's principal. After losing his job, he returned to Vermont and began to teach at a private school. John Dewey used to spend his free time reading theoretical theses and debated them with his former teacher, Hap Torrey. When his attraction with the theme increased, Dewey resolved to stop teaching and began studying psychology and philosophy at the Johns Hopkins University, where Granville Stanley Hall and George Sylvester mostly influenced him. Dewey felt unfit teaching basic school within the small town of Charlotte, Vermont, and being a high school tutor in Oil City, Pennsylvania. As a result, he continued his higher education and graduated with a doctorate degree from the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University in 1884. He studied with Granville Stanley Hall, Herbert Baxter Adams, Charles Sanders Peirce, and George Sylvester Morris. Dewey was later hired as an associate professor at the University of Michigan with the support of George Sylvester Morris and his unpublished thesis named The Cant Psychology. At the University of Michigan, he met Harriet Alice Chipman, and in 1886, they got married and later had 6 children. In 1888, John and his household went to the University of Minnesota, where he became a philosophy professor. Nonetheless, in 1889, they returned to the University of Michigan and trained there for 5 more years. In 1894, John Dewey headed the philosophy department at the University of Chicago. John Dewey remained at the University of Chicago until 1904. Additionally, he served as the head of its School of Education for 2 years. In 1904, he left college to join the Ivy League and become a professor at Columbia University. He also worked at a school for teachers on the side. In 1930, Dewey retired from Columbia and his teaching career with the title of Professor Emeritus. However, his wife had passed away 3 years prior in 1927. On December 11, 1946, John Dewey was remarried to his long-term colleague and companion for many years, Estelle Roberta Lowitz Grant. She requested Dewey to adopt 2 siblings, Louis, who altered to John Jr., and Shirley. On June 1st, 1952, John Dewey died of pneumonia at his homestead within New York, days after the diagnosis of his sickness, and was incarcerated the following day. The philosophical theses of Dewey were initially enthused by his reading of William James, the psychologist and also philosopher. The philosophy of Dewey, known as pragmatism or instrumentalism, was focused on human experiences. So moving on to important theoretical contributions by John Dewey, starting with pragmatism. John Dewey was once a leading proponent of the American College of Thought regarded as pragmatism, which is a view that rejected the dualistic epistemology and metaphysics of modern philosophy in favor of a naturalistic approach that viewed knowledge as arising from an active adaptation of the human organism to its environment. Pragmatism, faculty of philosophy, dominant in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century, based on the precept that the practicality, workability, and sensibleness of ideas, policies, and proposals are the standards of their merit. It stresses the precedence of action over doctrine, of experience over constant principles, and it holds the ideas It holds that ideas borrow their meanings from their consequences and their realities from their confirmation. Therefore, ideas are essentially instruments and plans of action. On this view, inquiry need not to be understood as consisting of a thinking passively, staring at the world and drawing from its thoughts as if genuine correspond to reality, but as a substitute method which initiates with a checker obstacle to profitable human action, proceeds to active manipulation of surroundings to check hypotheses and issues, and a readaptation of organism to environment that allows as soon as once more for human motion to proceed. With this view as his beginning point, Dewey developed a wide body of work encompassing certainly all of the fundamental areas of the philosophical subject in his day. According to Putnam, Dewey joined and provided progression to American pragmatism that philosopher and logician Charles Sanders Peirce established between the 19th and 20th centuries. The significance of investigational survey was another subject of early pragmatism that Dewey espoused. Peirce, for instance, extolled the scientific techniques, sincerity to recurrent analysis, as well as amendment of the hypothesis. He also alerted against handling any concept as a dependable replication of authenticity. Generally, pragmatists were enthused by the intense progress in know-how as well as scientific theory throughout the 19th century. In fact, many received official systematic teaching and performed an experiment in the social, physical, or natural sciences. Instrumentalism, the specific pragmatism version of Dewey, is an outlook that knowledge results from the understanding of relations between occasions or process of modification. For instance, an investigational review may attempt to understand how distortions in human organisms vary in connection to changes in a particular way of management, or how learners become better students when exposed to definite techniques of teaching. Real to the name he gave, also keeping in line with previous pragmatists, John Dewey believed that concepts are tools and instruments that human beings use to make better sense of the system. Particularly, concepts are plans of actions along with the forecasters of future proceedings. The tutelage reforms. Dewey was a stout supporter for liberal edifying changes. John held that tutoring must be founded on the concept of learning through action. In 1894, Dewey, as well as his spouse, began their private investigational primary college, the College Elementary Institute at the University of Chicago. His aim was to assess his didactic concepts. However, he resigned when the college chair fired his wife. In 1919, John Dewey and a handful of his friends, such as Wesley Clare Mitchell, James Harvey Robinson, Thorstein Veblen, and Charles Beard, established the original School for Community Study. This was a reformist investigational seminary that accentuated the free exchange of rational concepts in social sciences besides arts. Throughout the 1920s, Dewey taught on the didactic reforms at schools across the globe. John Dewey was specifically besieged with the Russian educational structure and shared whatever he learned with his friends when he came back to the States. Mainly that tutelage mainly emphasized the interactions of students with the existent. After retiring from tutoring in the 1930s, John Dewey became an active adherent of several edifying groups such as Intercontinental Group for Educational Freedom, as well as the New York Trainers. In the field of psychology, John Dewey's work influenced philosophy, education, and psychology, and he is frequently considered to be one of the zealous theorists of the 20th century. He emphasized broad-minded tutelage and greatly contributed to the usage of research instead of totalitarian strategy to data. Dewey first wrote books such as the Leibniz New Essays Concerning the Human Understanding in 1888 and Psychology in 1887, while teaching at the University of Michigan. Also, John Dewey was a creative writer and published at least 1,000 articles, essays, and books on varied range of subject comprising democracy, ethics, culture, religion, philosophy, nature, art, and education over his 65 years of the writing profession. So now moving on to the reading and the reflection reading that was in Lemaire's book, Democracy and Education, written by John Dewey. John Dewey notably has a great conceptual understanding of what democracy and a learning environment should be. He believes that the hands-on learning approach is the best method to dissipate knowledge into the minds of students. He compares it to lecturing, which he believes fails to convey the necessary knowledge to the student. He believes that a student effectively consumes knowledge through experience of touching and doing as opposed to just sitting and writing. As an educator, he believes that the children should act rather than listen. He considers his thoughts on democracy and why he thinks the student needs to be allowed the freedom to learn through experience, noting that through doing, the student obtains a firsthand knowledge or primary experience, something that is fundamentally consistent with learning in today's world. However, there were some shortcomings to Dewey's theory. In this day of education, schools have been equipped with workshops to enable students to get experience by themselves, as opposed to leaving everything to the teacher or instructor, who act as the guide and the know-it-all character. In doing so, Dewey believes that the demands of a child's spirit and desire to give, to do is to say, to serve, is effectively acknowledged. However, Dewey's theory on education fails to recognize the struggle that a child undergoes while learning new concepts. As a teacher, and during this time, his thoughts are centered on teaching. Instead, he notes that the school plays a vital role in imparting the virtues of democracy as well as developing the social character of a child. By this declaration, Dewey fails to acknowledge that the school does not spend time with the child, however, it's the teacher who does. In fact, one would ask, what is school? Will it be called school if there was no teacher? So how does school occupy the role of a teacher? In this admission, Dewey seems to be deserting his duty as a teacher and teaching the child some social and democratic habits to affect society. He does not recognize that, just like the school setting, the teacher has a great deal of responsibility and input in shaping or even restructuring the child's character. In coining the concept of the embryonic society, Dewey believed that was equated to the small community of a school to a larger world society. He thought that it would be consistent with the ideas of an autonomous world for both to be democratic. In this connection, Dewey's conviction leaves a lot of questions. Can we have a constitution of the world as we have for school? To what extent can the school be democratic? Should students be allowed to elect those they want to teach them? Should students decide on what to be incorporated into the syllabus and what not to? Do we have a common world culture? Indeed, these questions poke a hole in the practicality of Dewey's thoughts and his possible grasp of the real world. Though he did not develop this idea in the Democracy and Education, he applied the instruments of the concept in his understanding of how democratic school settings should be. He disregarded the reality that the world is composed of different cultures with varied social values and morals. Due to this diversity, therefore, it was as it still is today, to have a universal culture that would impose a widespread democratic world constitution as well as a similarly democratic school constitution. Dewey's profession of democracy is a form of life that was maturely fruitful and must be embodied in how peaceably people live together, share interests and frustrations, as well as make wise and informed decisions on relevant matters. Even today, democracy is embedded in the way people live and share with one another. However, what makes Dewey's thoughts on democracy awkward and inconsistent with the modern world is that he failed to recognize that democracy is inextricably tied with politics. We are, therefore, forced to assume that during this period, there were political parties that constantly struggled for power, there was no corruption, and that there was very limited to no debates on public matters that affected the nation and world at large. Even stranger was the dismissal of the majority and minority groups that form the basis of democracy, in which the majority will have their way while the minority have their say. These are fundamental concepts that each democratic society must have. Without them, it is not clear if such a society would be qualified to be called a democratic society. Failing to acknowledge this democratic principle, consequently, Dewey forces us to believe that he lacks the essential grasp of knowledge of what a democratic society, or school for that matter, should be. Going by the modern democratic principles, it would be almost impossible for a school to have students choose who to teach them and who not to, as this would give them more dictatorship over their teachers. That shouldn't be, yet it is the structure Dewey seems to propose. The other problem with this model is that students cannot have the prerogative of choosing what they should be taught, yet in Dewey's democratic ideal school, this should be the case. On the latter, though, some of Dewey's thoughts on democracy and education are inconsistent with the realities of the modern world. It is worth noting that his thoughts have greatly shaped the school system that we have today. So in conclusion, John Dewey has proved to contribute immensely to our society as an influential American educator, philosopher, and was considered the founder of pragmatism as well as the philosophical movement. He was a frontrunner of the liberal movement in education as well as a pioneer in functional psychology in the United States. Dewey was a creative writer and published at least 1,000 articles, essays, and books on a varied range of subjects comprising of democracy, ethics, culture, religion, philosophy, nature, art, and education over his 65 years of the writing profession. His work and teachings will remain engraved in the history of social theory for decades to come. And these are my references. That is my presentation. I thank you all for taking the time to check it out, and best of luck to the rest of you on your presentations. Have a good day.